No, I have. Thank you. All right. Ready. Good morning. Ena mana, ena reo, ena whenua o te ao, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Rez Gardi. I'm a former refugee. I'm Kurdish, and I greet you in Te Reo Māori, the language of the tangata whenua, Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I was fortunate to be able to be resettled and find a home free from persecution. And I acknowledge today that we're gathered here on the ancestral Lenape homelands and recognise the long-standing significance of these traditional lands for Lenape nations past and present. As the co-managing director of our seat, I've been in this space in the global stage since about 2015, working with a number of great refugee leaders, activists, advocates, allies, and have been honoured to work in the space alongside these people in the lead up to the Global Compact on Refugees. And together we've endeavoured to ensure that refugee voices are incorporated, are heard, and included in decision-making processes within the UNHCR system. And our seat as an international initiative evolved as a response to some of the frustration we were experiencing in the space, the excitement we had for opportunities that presented themselves, and also the variety of different gaps and potential that we could see for refugee leaders within the space to really be embedded and have a say in the decisions that impact our lives directly. So we work to enhance the effectiveness of global refugee response systems by co-designing refugee participation mechanisms to increase refugee participation in policymaking at the state and global level in ways that are meaningful, sustainable, and transformative. So on behalf of our seat and in collaboration with our partners, Refugees International, the New Humanitarian, and our co-hosts Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Mexico, I extend a warm welcome to you all today. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today in what is probably the most bustling week of Anga in New York City, and amongst all the different events that are happening this week in the Big Apple. We're truly honoured that you choose to be with us this morning for this conversation on reimagining the global refugee governance system and empowering refugee leadership ecosystem for a more resilient future. Just by way of background, I wanted to share a little bit about why this event, why here, why now. The post-World War to refugee governance structures have remained unchanged since the establishment of the system, despite the unprecedented challenges we are facing as a globe. Forced displacement, we know all too well in this room, is a growing concern, and the acceleration of the climate crisis is only going to exacerbate the issues that we're already experiencing. It is evident that the current strategies are inadequate to keep pace with the challenges that we're seeing and experiencing. And to address this, we need to reimagine our approach to refugee governance so that it can be more effective, more resilient, more inclusive, and sustainable. Humanitarian solutions on their own are no longer sufficient. With development and peace-building actors, they're required to address they're required to address the root causes and consequences of displacement together. Displacement is an issue that concerns the entire United Nations system. And so over the last few years, since 2018, a prominent theme that has been emerging, in particular in Geneva, has been a commitment to enhancing the role of refugees in the making and implementation of policies and programming that affect us, especially as articulated in paragraph 34 of the Global Compact on Refugees, which says that responses are most effective when they actively and meaningfully engage those that they're intended to protect and assist. So this paragraph calls for meaningful engagement of refugees in policy making and programming, but it still hasn't required the adequate attention that it needs, especially here in New York, where the Global Compact on Refugees was negotiated and agreed upon. So this event is strategically placed at the heart of New York, the heart of the UN system in New York during this United Nations General Assembly, because we believe this critical topic requires attention from Geneva all the way to New York. We must transcend humanitarian spaces and ensure that political will also drives the necessary changes rather than allowing the status quo to prevail. The refugee leadership ecosystem, comprised of refugee leaders, professionals, and officials within various different elements of the system, where they're working within UN agencies, working within INGOs, NGOs, within governments, within RLOs, refugee-led organizations, or other capacities, must be central to the transformation of the current system. Refugees with their lived experiences understand the failings of the current refugee system far better than anyone else because of the personal experiences they've had. And they're more aware of the shortcomings as well as the successes of the current systems, and so are best positioned to reimagine how responses and the involvement of new actors can take place to make the system more accountable, legitimate, and effective. So to really transform the global refugee system, we're saying we need to reimagine a system where refugees actively participate, and that is the norm within the system, to influence the policies and the programs that affect our lives directly. Our inclusion will make the refugee system more equitable, and so through this panel, we hope to highlight the untapped opportunities embedded within the refugee leadership ecosystem and the transformative change that can be achieved when such potential is engaged by the stakeholders that are involved, and that we all work together in a multi-stakeholder approach to make the system stronger. It's my great honor to be able to introduce this fabulous lineup of speakers we have for you this morning. So first, it is my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Marta Youth. She's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration in the U.S. Department of State, and has responsibility for the Office of the Executive Director, the Office of International Migration, and the Office of Assistance for Western Hemisphere. She was previously the Director of Central American Affairs in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and prior assignments include Director of the Office of Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas in PRM, as well as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua and Economic Counselor at the U.S. Mission in Ottawa, Canada. She's also worked at the U.S. Embassy in Quito, Ecuador. She's served overseas at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid as a trade officer and in the U.S. Consulate in Chennai, India as a consular officer. During her State Department career, additional assignments have also included assignments in Washington, D.C., including Country Assistance Coordinator for Russia and Moldova, South Africa Desk Officer, and Portugal, Malta, and Vatican City Desk Officer. She's been assigned twice to the State Department's Economic and Business Affairs Bureau. She's been in the Foreign Service for more than 25 years and is a member of the Senior Foreign Service. She has a BA in Political Science and Economics from St. Peter's University in New Jersey and has pursued graduate studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Italy and in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today, Marta. Next we have, further on my right, Sarah Smith. She leads the Homelessness, Refugees and Safe Water Initiative, as well as the disaster and program-related investments for the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation. She's worked in the humanitarian sector throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East for 25 years. Prior to joining the foundation, she was the head of Education, Child Protection, and Youth Livelihoods for the International Rescue Committee. And at the International Rescue Committee, she led the design of several historic programs, including the Ahlan Simsim, an early childhood development initiative with Sesame Workshop in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, which won the MacArthur Foundation's inaugural $100 million 100 and Change Prize. She's been named as a leading global thinker by Foreign Policy magazine in 2016. She began her career as a Head Start preschool teacher in Ohio and as a Peace Corps volunteer in Namibia. She's earned her master's degree in international policy from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education and a doctorate in education from Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us today. And on the far right, we have Dr. Huri Tafich, who's the program manager for refugee leadership at Refugees International. Before joining Refugees International, she was a program manager for the University Alliance for Refugee and At-Risk Migrants. She currently also serves as an advisor for the United States Refugee Advisory Board, USRAB. Before arriving in the United States, she co-founded Spark 15 in Malta, the first refugee-led organization recognized by the UNHCR. In 2016, she was selected as one of 40 young leaders to represent young refugees in Geneva. In 2020, she was one of 6 women from the United States and Canada awarded a prestigious Margaret McNamara Education Grant. And in 2021, she was awarded an international fellowship from American Association of University Women. She has a doctoral degree in global affairs from Rutgers University. Thank you so much for joining us today. And last, but certainly not least, to my left, we have Jonathan Majok. He's a director of Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative, RAFTI for short, at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he's also the Deputy Director of Development and Senior Director of Grants Management. He was a senior program analyst with the Global Risk and Resilience Program, where he started as a program associate in 2013. His perspective on forced displacement and refugee issues are informed by his lived experience and scholarship. He studied the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980 that established the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, through which he came to the United States. As a former refugee from South Sudan, he has lived 13 years in refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya. He graduated from honors from the University of Arizona with a Bachelor of Science in Public Administration and Policy, and he also holds a Master of Public Administration from George Mason University. So thank you so much for joining us. As you can see, we've got an incredible lineup of panelists who bring a great diversity of educational experience, work experience, and lived experience from various different walks of life, and very excited to get right into the questions then. So starting first, what are some specific aspects of the current refugee governance structure that have proved inadequate for addressing displacement needs? And if possible, could you provide examples? Maybe I'll pose this first question to Jonathan.
Thank you, Reese, and good morning. To be able to imagine a system, a global system, we need to think of the shortcomings that are within the system. And I will briefly talk about some key aspects related to assumptions, mindsets, behavior, and governance in the current system. So first, we all agree that the system is outdated, and it has been established, for more than 70 years. It has served humanity for that duration, but the scale of the current for the displacement challenge are not. The system is not relevant or has lost some relevance to it, and therefore we need to think of a new structure, not to disband the system, but find ways to reform it. The system has flawed assumptions, and one of the assumptions is that forced displacement is a temporary phenomenon, camp-based, and that was the assumption of the 20th century. Right now, research, and we all know that forced displacements are protracted. More than 60% of refugees live in urban, and so it's no longer camp-based as it was envisioned 70 years ago. And so that assumption is flawed at the current moment, and we need to rethink it. There is then a mindset that excludes lived experience of the refugees and viewing them as passive victims. I think there is a need to shift that narrative to frame that refugees also have human agency. They have lived experience they know the context, and therefore can be key players on issues that affect them. And that mindset needs to change, that frame refugees as passive victims. That is a shortcoming of the system. We also have the behavior of the state. The current system is biased toward the states. So the state has control over this. And the behavior that we do not have an enforcing mechanism, that accountability mechanism, that if a state fails its obligation, especially under the 1951 Geneva Convention, what are the consequences? That is a key failure in the system, because a state can do whatever they want to do, regardless of the obligations. And even those who have signed the 1951 Geneva Convention, they are free riders. So that behavior need to somehow be controlled. So the absence of accountability mechanism is a shortcoming in the system. And then what, the UN system in general was established for all countries to cooperate on an issue that is beyond one country. And this, the spirit of responsibility sharing. Right now, in the state of responsibility sharing, there is responsibility shifting, where some countries put refugees away from their borders and they want them to be in some region. And I think that needs to change. There are countries that are hosting a large number of refugees. In the spirit of responsibility sharing, we could provide them resources, but they are struggling. And every year there is this chronic shortfall in funding. And finally, and then I'll give a chance to another, is that the governance structure. The global refugee structure has become a huge bureaucracy. It is very complex and difficult to navigate. And one example is when the UNHCR Executive Committee was established as the decision-making body more than 70 years ago, there were 20 member states in the committee. And then the number increased to 102 in 2018. And now we are at 108 member states in the executive committee that make decisions on behalf of refugees, the UNHCR. That is simply ineffective. But with that, there are no refugees in the decision-making body on issues that affect them. And so you see these shortcomings, and I think that gives us what we need to do to address these shortcomings. Stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. And if I may, maybe also go to Huri, if you have some.
Sure, thank you. So I feel like if we want to paint how the current situation when it comes to refugee global governance is, we can just go to a camp and try to mention the word United Nations or human rights or NGOs, and you would see the reaction of the people on the ground. People are frustrated and they lost the trust of it. They either laugh or they were like, are you joking us? Or like, what's happening here, right? So people really lost trust in these notions that we see it as running the refugee global governance. And that's why I think it's the biggest evidence that it reflects the flaws in the current global governance. And John had talked about a very important points to why this global system is not working. And I'm gonna touch upon 3 more reasons, or maybe expanding what John was saying. First thing is, when a refugee crisis hit, the current system deals with it as if it's temporary, pushing a lot of money for a year or 2 or 3 and pull out, right? That's it. There is no further thinking that this is gonna stay for 10, 20. In my case as a Palestinian refugee, it has been for 7 years now, going on, because the system dealt with the situation as temporary, a humanitarian relief fund, and that's it. There were no further thinking into, okay, we have to think about development, we have to think about political will, economic empowerment, and all of that. So the actual reactive approach to just go there, dump a lot of money for certain years, and that's it, this is not gonna solve it. And our situation as Palestinian refugee in Lebanon is the biggest example of that. We have been there in camps for 75 years, nothing's changed yet. You have no access to right to work, you have no access to, let's say, to buy a house or any of that. So we are not building a life, right? We are just building a survival mode. And I see this situation again and again repeating itself now with the Syrians and with the Libyans and even in Africa, it have been going on for long that we have to rethink it. The second thing is also, as Jonathan was talking about, is the lack of refugee access to decision-making tables. If we have to go now and see, they have been including refugees on the tables, but it have been always, we bring a refugee to tell their stories, for sure, make us feel good that, okay, we're helping refugees. But then when the policy talking happening, we have to leave the room, right? This is how it always is. We there to tell you a story, leave, and then the policy people get to talk. And this is not how it should be, right? Because we're not talking also about bringing a random refugee, as it's always also happening, to the table to tell their stories and leave. We're talking about refugees who have really expertise, who have professional expertise, who have educational expertise. So the lived experience is an added value that makes their professional and educational experience more relative, but it is not the only thing should be on the table, and this is not should be the qualifying factor why I have to be on the table. So as long as we don't see more refugees in executive positions and leadership positions in organizations that really matter and do impact their lives, we're not gonna see a change. If I'm not mistaken, the first Higher Commissioner for Refugee was a refugee himself, but now we are 7 years later, we didn't see that happen. And if we have to think about it logically, I cannot comprehend that among 100 million people, there is one qualified person to be in that position. So it's just we have to rethink how things are happening. The third thing is about funding for refugee-led organizations. Refugee-led organizations are very underfunded. We know also not only refugee-led organizations, they are part of the local system, right? And local organizations are underfunded. We know it's less than 2%. But when we talk about refugee-led organizations, it's even less than 0.3%. So even though they are underfunded, they have proven very successful in delivering impacts because they are the one on the ground, right? They're the one leading the work. During COVID-19, they have proved that they were the first one to respond on the ground when outside organizations couldn't really make it. So when it comes also to funding, it's a big issue. So if we are talking about reimagining the system, and this is not an easy thing, and we're imagining a system that have been there for 7 years now, we're talking about changing at different levels, on individual levels, on institutional level, on government level. Some individuals do need to leave their jobs because they have not been there. They shouldn't be there in the first place. While others, for sure not everyone, but if we have to think really logically and practically, yes, governments need to rethink policies and need to rethink funding mechanisms. Philanthropy, the same, they need to rethink. So in order to get there, we really need, as Jonathan was saying, a full society approach where different stakeholders really have a role here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hudi. And I think both Jonathan and Hudi have mentioned that to reimagine the system, we're not talking about disbanding the current system exactly, but thinking of new ways that it can be enhanced and work better, because obviously in the state of the world that we're living in, negotiating a new refugee convention might not lead to more rights, but rather less rights. So thinking about having what we've already got that on paper is great, but how do we, at a practical level, ensure that it is effective and legitimate and accountable to the people that it's intended to protect and serve. And both have mentioned that this is a multi-stakeholder approach, and we have different roles to play from different parts of society. And so that takes us nicely, I think, to think about what roles some other actors and partners in this space could be doing, that there's a role to be played with refugees themselves and governments and private philanthropy partners as well. So if I may go to you, please, What do you think the role of governments is in responding to some of these shortcomings that our panelists have discussed to ensure a more inclusive and resilient refugee governance system can be taken up this big challenge?
Thanks so much, and thanks for the. We're very proud to work with the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board and with our seat. Is this picking up?
Yes.
Does it need it? Yes. All right. And other refugee-led organizations. This is. We think it's so important for refugees to actively participate and influence policy decisions. And I don't want to contradict one of the speakers, but I will. It is true that XCOM generally has not had refugee voices. But last year, and I don't know if Baswa is here. I think she was supposed to be here.
Yeah.
Yes. So last year I should have realized the red scarf. But so last year at XCOM, our ambassador, our assistant secretary, Julieta Noyes, did bring Baswa with her and asked her to present at XCOM, something that we're going to repeat this year as well. And I think that this is part of the reality that there is definitely a recognition. It is, for me, like that it was noteworthy that Baswa was the first, I think, refugee who spoke at XCOM. And I think others may have followed suit as well rapidly because it's common sense, right? It was like immediately when it was done, like it was an aha moment, and everyone was like, "Well, we should have thought of that, and we should be doing this, right?" And in fact, this year we are the president pro temp of the Intergovernmental Consultation. It's a really long title on migration, asylum, and refugees, and this is kind of it's not a policy-making organization, but it's an organization of all of these like-minded countries who do a lot of work in the refugee and migration and asylum area. We hosted in May a senior officials meeting in Washington, D.C., and we also, in recognition that at none of our ICG meetings in the past had we ever had refugees present, we spent the entire morning with several panels, including people present in the room, to actually hear refugee voices. So we didn't then usher out the refugees and make policy. It wasn't that kind of meeting. But that is noted as well, right? That it is important. And I think this is a reality that governments really are now becoming really attuned to. Nothing about us without us is kind of completely digested and understood. And so part of the challenge for us is to make sure that this is not some kind of fad. This is something that going forward, in my notes I saw somebody wrote, we make sure that there's a space at the table. I kind of cringed when I saw that because it's not kind of like, oh, let's pull up the extra chair and squeeze somebody in. There should always be a seat at the table for the people who have the most in tune experience and perspective. So that is definitely something that is positive. However, there's some challenges also that, like the assumption, right? The camp-based and temporary displacement. This is not the reality of the world right now. I mean, this is what we are seeing is this unprecedented movement of refugees and migrants and forcibly displaced people all over the world, and the numbers continue to grow. And really, it isn't. I always think of PRM as the bureau in the State Department that does the humanitarian funding, but I always think that we are kind of the Band-Aid. The funding that really needs to be focused on is the funding that deals with the root causes. What are the structural reasons that people are on the move, and what is it that can be done to provide people with options to actually stay, right? And not everybody is going to have an option to stay in their country. There are reasons that people flee for persecution and so forth that, you know, cannot be mitigated by development assistance. But there's also assistance that can be provided, and one of the things that we're looking at now is this massive movement of people due to climate, right? So what is it that we can do to help with an adaptation and resilience? And I know these are not, I do not want to get into the climate refugee, climate migrant debate, so we won't. But one of the things when we're looking at just people who are forcibly displaced, we know that once somebody is displaced once, the chances are that they will continue to be displaced unless kind of the issues that have moved them have been dealt with. And so these are all challenges that I think as we look at the protracted nature of displacement and these prolonged refugee situations that we're now seeing, we need to really, as John so succinctly laid out, we need to really kind of look again at our assumptions starting out, and look at what new tools we can bring in to kind of advance some of the progress in some of these issues before people actually have to move or move again.
Thank you. And it's important, to acknowledge the work that some governments around the world are doing to ensure that refugees are included. And we note that it is still very early days for a lot of these states that have come on board, recognized that it is important, and are figuring out how that looks in reality, because it's one thing to recognize the importance of including the voices of those directly affected by displacement, and agree in principle that there is value that they can bring, but the practical reality of what does that look like? How do we move from a tokenistic approach to something that is embedded and institutionalized within the system? That part takes time, and there are relationships to be built between refugee groups and the governments that they are working with in that process, and developing rapport, trust, working together, understanding what partnership means for both sides, how do they work together, and in what kind of principles do they work by, what kind of values drives this relationship. And at the work that we do, with the work that we do with our seat, we're working with a number of different states to institutionalize refugee participation in policy making, the U.S. of course being one of them, and we've got representatives from the United States Refugee Advisory Board here in the audience and as part of the panel, and in Canada, in Germany, in New Zealand, in Australia. And it's really important when they see other states doing this, like you rightly noted, when they see another state doing this, there can be the sense of, why aren't we doing something like this, and how do we do it? And so it's really important that power that states have in the space to influence other states to take this step forward, and then understanding how it looks. And I think we recognize that it moves from perhaps starts with more symbolic gestures, including refugees as part of their delegation being given the opportunity to speak on some of these topics, until hopefully we get to a level where it becomes so institutionalized and mainstream that no policies are ever considered without refugees being involved throughout the entire process. And so it's exciting to see the success and development with our partner states, and seeing what they do next. And of course, it's a work in progress that we work on together. I'm going to go to you, Jonathan, to hear about maybe some expectations that you believe we should have of governments, your own government and governments around the world, of what they could be doing better to ensure that refugees are included in these processes.
Thank you. And I do recognize and accept the idea that our government, the United States government, focusing on the root causes, and other governments should do the same thing, because let's look at the past 25 years, the number of forcibly displaced people have increased 3 times or quadruple to more than 110 million now. Billions of dollars have been invested. So let us ask, are we getting a return on investment? There must be something wrong. And this is why we are talking about reimagining the system. Should go beyond symbolic gestures or inviting refugees to be guest speakers or ambassadors of goodwill. We need to integrate them formally into the system. And there is a recognition, the trend now toward refugee participation. Recently, the UNHCR defined the refugee-led organization. That is really a significant step because it acknowledged that these RLOs are really integral, should be really acknowledged. The example of the executive committee of the UNHCR, which is a decision-making body, of having no refugee formally part of the decision-making is something that we need to rethink because it's not just like what the United States has done. It's leading by example, bringing refugees in those forums. But it goes beyond that. They should be formally part of the decision-making in order to bring the context to this. Let's think, who is actually at the decision-making table here at the UNHCR? There are countries that chase refugees away from their countries, and they are part of the decision-making. Those countries need to think why their citizens live in the first place. And if refugees are represented in that, I think they can go beyond simple statement by governments of member states. And that's the formal reimagining that we need to see. The structure itself has to make sure refugees, human agency, live experience is part of the system. But again, coming back to the root causes, I think this is where government need to invest in bilateral or multilateral diplomatic talks. These countries that have wars, conflict, are our bilateral partners. What do we say to them when we meet at the table, at the government level? I think these are the things. And then continue to recognize that lived experience bring a different contact. People with lived experience speak from their hearts. That is not lip talking. And I think that brings the context and that people move to act on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've been talking, that's my mic. Thank you. Is it still on? I didn't break it? Okay. Great. So a little dramatic pause, and now back to it. We've been talking about the role of governments and refugees working together, and now I'd like to introduce to the conversation another really critical and important player, and that's our philanthropy partners. So Sarah, turning to you now, what role do you think philanthropy has in responding to some of the shortcomings that we're seeing within the system to ensure that we have a more inclusive and resilient refugee governance system?
Sure, thanks, Rez, and it's so great to be here with all of you. I think philanthropy plays a really important role in two ways. One, I think with funding, obviously, and also with advocacy. When it comes to funding, we obviously don't have the biggest checkbooks in the room, and we don't have as much resources as the bilateral and multilateral partners. But we have much more flexible funding. We can fund things that governments have a harder time funding. We can fund refugee-led organizations and refugee leaders directly. And we can push others to do that. And we can fund in ways and things that others might be resistant or reluctant to do at the outset. So we can fund multi-year programs when others maybe aren't able to or are unwilling to, and show that multi-year funding is really important. we can fund things like economic development programs and long-term education programs for refugees, when often the system isn't funding those kinds of things, and demonstrate how important they are. On the advocacy front, I think we have a couple different roles. First, we can, as philanthropy and as people in philanthropy, speak out ourselves about issues that I think it's harder for especially implementing organizations to speak out about. I think we can be a little bit more impatient, perhaps, and I think Jonathan speaking about refugees' engagement and this sort of, I think that in many ways there's too much patience in the system. We can talk about how refugees shouldn't be just a seat dragged up to the table and a participant, but actually leading the system itself and leading the decision making, and speak out about the reforms that need to happen within UNHCR, for instance, and UNHCR's leadership, but also what UNHCR's role is in the system itself, and as a decision maker, but also an implementer, and really push boundaries. But in most ways, more importantly, we can fund advocacy organizations and fund refugees as advocates, and ensure that refugees and the organizations here are able to advocate in ways that are really going to make the change that is ultimately needed.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think it's important to acknowledge the Hilton Foundation as being one of the few in the space that are funding so many refugee-led organizations that do focus on system change. Because I think sometimes that can be difficult for some funders to understand the work you do around advocacy and trying to change the system versus traditional funders that might just want to fund direct humanitarian and aid delivery kind of work. So thank you to you and our other partners that have been so supportive behind this work and pushing us from behind the scenes to get the system change that we so desperately need in the space. Hudi, I might go to you as well to maybe add your perspectives of what you think funders and philanthropy partners can be doing more in this space, and maybe a call to some that have not come on board yet, but maybe thinking. So how can we encourage that?
Sure, thank you. So I see, as Sarah was saying, and as you said, Rez, yes, philanthropic partners have been really supportive in the, what we say, refugee leadership movement. And as I was saying before, when we started back in 2015, it's so different than now. We're talking a movement that have been going for 8 years. And we acknowledge that we have some steps that have been done, but also, as Jonathan said, there is more to come, hopefully. When it comes to funding, I believe there is a trend from funders, private funders, toward funding refugee-led organization of refugee leadership, which is great and have led to a really very positive result so far. But I also see that there is some kind of, because it's a trend, we don't, like, the only thing that I think about, we don't want the funders to get lost in this route of funding just for refugee leadership cause, because I feel some organization jumping on the trend for funding purposes, not for a change purposes, right? So they know that the funders are now interested in that. Funders are really leading a movement toward refugee leadership. So how can we make sure that the funding is really effective and going to the right place and doing the right change we really hope for? And this is also relates more on how the funders, even if private funders, are in touch or in collaboration and partnership with refugees themselves and refugee-led organizations themselves, while also strategizing, right? And I think this is something also, as someone who talked with Hilton Foundation and Hilton funders, I feel like one positive thing is the flexibility that I had when dealing with Hilton. Like, yes, if you think this is the right thing, we're backing you up, right? You can do that. So the flexibility when it comes to funders is really important when it comes to these issues, because refugee-led organization is a bit different in complexity and nature than others. And the second, also, as I said, to make sure that it is not just a trend and we're jumping on in the trend of refugee leadership, but really the money is going to the right places and doing the right change. The second thing, I believe also, the movement have been really supported by funders like private donors, but we have not really got to a point where we can see that we have a change at scale, right? So, and in order to have a change like scale, we need the multilateral and the bilateral stakeholders to jump on board and also be able to support RLOs or refugee-led organizations directly, or local organizations. And this is actually one of the things that we are thinking about at Refugees International, on how we can really work with other stakeholders in the field to build something where multilateral stakeholders and bilateral can really feel comfortable and trustworthy, like we can put really money here and we know that it is well taken care of and it's going to local organization, right? So because we know, like when it comes to multilateral stakeholders, it's not easy, right? To just give money directly. So we need to really think about this other mechanism of how we can do so in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and bringing new partners and different kind of partners to this funding space is obviously crucial. And interesting example is in the New Zealand context. So we established the New Zealand Refugee Advisory Panel, and very early on, the New Zealand government decided that they wanted to fund this directly because it was to their benefit. And so I think this is quite a unique model in this space where in many other contexts, we've got private partners that are funding mechanisms so that we can do the work, get governments to see the value in working directly with partners, and then this unique example of New Zealand saying, we believe this is the right thing to do and we're going to fund this from the beginning. So I think that's a really strong example, and hope that other states can think about how they may do this in the future as well. And taking what we've been talking about in terms of some of the challenges that we're seeing in the space, touching on some of the work that private partners and government partners have been doing, I want to turn back to you, Deputy Assistant Secretary, to think about maybe an example of a successful policy change that demonstrates a fruitful collaboration between refugee leadership ecosystem and governments that has led or has the potential to lead to better outcomes for refugees. So however you interpret that is your choosing.
Thanks. And I think I probably answered that question in my first answer a little bit, but as you so eloquently described it, is how do we go from the symbolic to the institutionalizing of it, right? And I think we're on that road. I don't think we're 100% there yet, but it has been now the IGC meetings, the XCOM meetings, the ATCR meetings as well. We have now, it is becoming the thing that we make sure that we're doing, that we make sure that refugee voices are in the room. And I will say that the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration is an unusual bureau in the State Department. And I've been in, my bio says 25 years. It's actually more like 32 years that I've been in the department. And nowhere else in the department quite has the culture of PRM. It is a kind of consensus-driven microcosm of, and one of the things that that for me, I feel that we are the Humanitarian Bureau of the department that heartened me is that we've had an ongoing debate even within the bureau about just even on nomenclature, because we've always talked about those who who benefit from our programs as beneficiaries, and that is clearly like not the the correct terminology, and so there's like a debate. Stakeholders, is it participants, is it how? But you just say, well, it's just a name, right? But what it means is it is a changing of mindset. It is a changing of understanding how people who participate in our programs, who we are providing assistance to, also have a stake in that. And so I think this is all happening really all at the same time, and I think that this is what has changed, and I think this is where we're going in terms of institutionalizing this. And for us, I think that what our responsibility is to also bring along other countries who maybe have not quite gotten the memo, or maybe are reluctant in this way. So I do think that this is important. And then the other thing that now that I say this as as COVID is returning, but for me, one of the things that now that we're back on the road again and visiting, I mean, it is so important for us to be able to have the one-on-one discussions with people who are in the field, people who are affected by our programs, and hear directly from them. What you were saying about how like the UN or so UNHCR might be a bad word in a camp I mean, I think we really, this is really another important aspect of this for us to really, in addition to engaging directly with refugee-led organizations, to again get back into the habit of getting out into the field and really engaging directly with those who are participating in our programs and seeing how decisions that are made from 3,000 miles away are having a direct impact on lives.
Absolutely, and that's really integral to knowing what works and what doesn't work and how to have better programs, because I think here it's clear when you're delivering the programs and the policies that you all are, it's with the intention of bettering the system and having outcomes for the people affected. So there's obviously a vested interest on both sides to have outcomes that work. And so it's a really important partnership that I must say it's still quite early. It's a very new movement, as Hudi said, that some of these conversations only really began around 2015. It's the time that we first had the privilege of meeting through the Global Refugee Youth Consultations, and we were one of the young people invited to just share our story of what it was like to be a child refugee, and that was the entire expectation is just tell your story, tell the journey of how you lived in a refugee camp. And then since 2015, it's not that long ago, we've come a long way actually in quite a small space of time. And I think despite identifying the challenges that still exist, it's important to also take a step back sometimes and see how far we've come within this short period, and what things have been working, and what partners have enabled this progress since that time, and how we can better even ask for the demands that we have to ensure that the system is better. It's a new movement. We're all learning. We're all on this journey together. And with each of these experiences, I think our seat is uniquely placed to reflect how different states are engaging with refugees, and then learning in that process what worked, what could be done better next time. Was there an element that a different state engaged or an initiative that they had taken on board that worked and that perhaps other states could benefit from learning? And so this collaborative approach between states, between refugees, is also really important to strengthening this very new movement. And on the same note, I think, Sarah, would love to ask you around a similar line of question, thinking about an example in your work where the support funding that you've been able to help refugees with has led or boosted the effectiveness of RLOs in the space.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, all of, I think, the grants we've been lucky enough to work on with refugee-led organizations have been extraordinary and had great impact. We fund 10 refugee-led organizations, and out of our relatively small refugee portfolio at the foundation, 7 of those are direct service implementation grants, and those are, as I mentioned, doing sort of longer term, what would be considered longer term development kinds of programs. They're livelihoods programs, early childhood programs. 3 of the 10 are focused on global advocacy kinds of things. Rez, I'm glad you talked a little bit about RC, because you should speak about the amazing work that RC is doing. We fund the Coalition for Venezuela, and then also the Global Refugee-Led Network. And so those global advocacy groups and that work, or regional advocacy in the case of the Coalition for Venezuela, are just essential. And you made the case better than I ever could. But I think that that's where essentially the real policy change work, I think, is going to happen. No pressure, but I think the other thing that we're doing is funding certain kinds of intermediation. We have a grant to the, it's called the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, and this really, it's known as, and this is a project that's funding a global or a pooled fund for refugee-led organizations, and it's governed completely by refugee-led organizations, so decision-making about where the grants go in this pooled fund, they go to other refugee-led organizations, but really, crucially, the governance of how the funds are distributed it's all decisions are made by the refugee-led organizations that sit on the advisory board. And that kind of work is also crucial because it will, we hope, help funders that have a harder time funding smaller organizations understand that there are options out there. It's not just about, you can't fund a refugee-led organization because they don't have the absorptive capacity, because that's often what we hear our refugee-led organization partners telling us that they're hearing from the donors, but that there are these different ways of pulling together resources so that it's easier for refugee-led organizations to get bigger funding immediately.
Thank you. And I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll just give each speaker maybe the opportunity to add anything extra that maybe I haven't asked directly, but you'd like to add, or a call to action, or a recommendation that you'd like to put to the audience, some thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with, so that we can maybe have about 15 minutes for Q&A as well. So I'll go to you first, Jonathan, for any final thoughts.
In order to imagine the system, we need to change our mindsets and assumptions on some of the things in the system. Just one example here that we usually send students abroad to study foreign language and 3 months, or go to Peace Corps for 6 months or 1 year. And we take those as expertise in that particular region. I mean, if we get, say, people who have been study abroad have regional expertise for those 3 to 6 months, 1 year, why is it difficult to recognize the experience of refugees who have lived in camps for decades, and it's their lived experience? Why is not an expertise? So think about that, and I think the trend toward that recognition is positive, and I think if the public know all this and start thinking differently, it's going to affect how policies are made in different governments or states around the world. the first UNHCR commissioner was a refugee. He has lived experience. And I quote what he has to say more than 70 years ago. If the international protection of refugees is to mean anything, it must mean that refugees are at least able to see and talk to a representative of the authority which is supposed to be protecting them. And that is, you know, there has been thought leadership contribution to international framework by people with refugee experience. But somewhere, somehow, it got lost in the scholarship and in literature. I think we need to bring that back. One example in the current Geneva Convention is the non-refoulement principle, that refugees cannot be returned to where their lives would be in harm. And that was proposed by a person with lived experience. So we need to institutionalize their expertise, their perspective, so that we manage the 21st century forced displacement. And I think the trend, U.S. leading by example, start shaping this is really good and would encourage others to follow suit. Thank you.
I mean, not like a call of action, but what I want to say is what Jonathan was talking about. Yes, that we're moving in the right direction, hoping, and I don't know how many years we won't be able. We won't need this conversation, right? Hopefully, we won't be saying why refugees should be on the table and still make the case for it and how it should work. Hopefully, like, we see ourselves in a time where a refugee on the table is just a norm. It's not like questioning like how or where and how to make that happen. So it's not like a kind of call of action, but it's more of inspiration that hopefully we're moving in the right direction, hopefully with the support of governments like USA taking the lead and funders and private funders, we keep moving in that right direction to get to a place where we don't have to justify why, and it start being perceived as something normal. We're just on the table because this is how it should be. Thank you.
The emerging norm.
Exactly.
I'll go to you, Sarah.
Sure. Yeah, I think two calls, maybe one for funders. It's an obvious one, but I think really investing in refugee leadership and refugee-led organizations and finding ways to do it. It's not that hard. It's, you know, I know there are huge challenges in the bureaucratic systems of funders and that are not easy to overcome, but I think that funding refugee-led organizations is really a very easy first step that should become the norm as well. And I think too, I hear your point, Huri, about changing the challenges right now of pushing to change the Refugee Convention, and I'm trying and being urged to be patient, and it's true, I think, that there are risks that come along with it, but I also think that there are changes to not just the norms, but the actual policies that flow from it that really need to be pushed for, and we can't lose that urgency. I think that there's a tendency for these changes to just take far too long, and we've been too patient so far. That's my.
Thank you, and I'll go to you for the final remarks.
Well, I'll be quick. So I think that, you know, how we approach this, and, you know, is really the first thing is the responsibility towards. As a funder, we look at the responsibility to refugees and stateless and displaced persons and those who participate in the programs, but also we have to look at it in terms of responsibility to the real funders, the U.S. taxpayer. And so a lot of how we approach things is based on that responsibility, and accountability, and, you know, making sure, and it's, I will say the responsibility is huge because, you know, and philanthropy as well, I'm sure. When you're making a decision, you're making a positive decision to fund something, but at the same time, you're also making a decision not to fund something else. And that really weighs, I think, a lot on a lot of us, because you know that there's great vulnerability, there's great need, and the needs outpace the resources, and so whatever you're deciding is not going to have a good impact on somebody. It's a huge responsibility, and so I think that we also try to approach it with open-mindedness and humility as well. And part of that humility is understanding that we don't have all the answers, and we would be foolish not to benefit from the people who have had the experience and whose perspectives most matter. And so I am hopeful that with that understanding, we're moving in a better direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our panelists. And I think that allows us some time to open up to the audience for any questions that you may have. Sure. The mic coming around here.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this panel, Rez, and for the great job that you are doing moderating it. I am sitting here with two fellow members of the Refugees International Board, and I couldn't omit the opportunity to thank Sarah Smith and the Hilton Foundation. You really are doing an extraordinary job. Thanks to you, Refugees International House Fourier, because you are funding a very, very important organization, program that we have at RI, which is to include refugees in a mentoring capacity. And it's really been brilliant in the early days. But, I wish more philanthropic organizations could learn from what Hilton is doing, because you really set this stage. Sarah, I also know you from your work at IRC, because I've been on the IRC board since 1995. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to hear from all of you, Jorge, too. And I know PRM very, very well from my days at State. So I'm always, always impressed by the PRM performance. But, as you mentioned, a call to action. So I was thinking it would be wonderful if we could leave this session with saying, these are the things that we in the audience who believe in this mission have to do. So could amongst you, could you name 3 organizations within UNHCR or UN system globally that need to have a permanent refugee spokesman in their decision making? What would it be? Where should we focus our energy on getting refugees as permanent members of these decision-making institutions?
Thank you. That's a great question. Maybe I'll have an attempt first and then open to anybody else on the panel. I think my perspective would be that it's not any one organization, but we need to think about how we reimagine the system to not put refugees on the side here. So this is the refugee advisory body for UNHCR, or this is the advisory body for this mechanism, and that is the only way refugees can ever exchange their views with outside external parties. But actually think about how do we revolutionize the system so that we've got refugees embedded throughout. We've got refugees in the pipeline to reach senior positions within UNHCR, because currently we don't have that. Right now, most of the positions that UNHCR is available for refugees are volunteer positions or very low P1. And we know that there are refugees that have the ability, the experience, the education to be managing departments and teams within UNHCR, but they're just not getting those opportunities. So how do we ensure that there's an opportunity, the pipeline that ensures that refugees are in the consideration for these positions in the first place? How do we ensure that governments are hiring refugees at very senior levels? And I can criticize my own government as well, because very often, for example, in government perspectives, the roles that are open for refugees are community engagement, because that's the only thing refugees are seen as able to do, engage with their own communities. What about in those really senior policy advisor positions? What about in director positions? What about in all these policy-oriented positions? Why are refugees not being hired in those positions? And I don't think it's for lack of experience or education. So embedded throughout the system there, within INGOs and NGOs that have influence in the international system, are they hiring refugees for these kind of positions? And there are a few organizations that are doing this, but it needs to become more of a thing. So not just hiring refugees at very low-level positions, and then that's it, or it's usually for very short-term, temporary positions, but actually thinking about embedding them throughout their organizations. And then also within philanthropy as well, refugees with experience and the right backgrounds to be working within these portfolios, because then they can use their perspectives to help decide what is good use of money, where can funding be channeled to that can have the most impact. So I think it's thinking about all the ways we could be embedding it rather than just thinking about this just one way of including refugees. But I'll open up to the panel to add.
I think you covered it right. Yeah, it's not about specific, it's about the actual structure and making sure that people from refugee background have access or easier access to executive position or leadership position. And here also just one hint. I think sometimes it's hard for organization to hire, because if I had someone applying who is Harvard graduate and a refugee applying from overseas with a university degree, then, oh, we better, like if we're comparing, we're gonna go, but I'm not saying there's no refugees or graduate from Harvard, but this is the decision that they might say, oh, but they're graduating from here, the one from there. So here comes the value of the lived experience and the regional expertise, which should outweigh sometimes just having a degree from Ivy League organization in the US, which I feel a lot of organizations get trapped into that, like where we want to go for the perfect candidates based on the qualifications and not give the regional and lived experience away in that.
I think we can start a small step at a time or at the same time. And I would target the UNHCR because it's when it was mandated more than 70 years ago, it was to focus on two primary responsibilities. That's refugee protection and finding solutions to the refugee plight. And if you assess how it has been now in these several decades, you can see that it has either exceeded its mandate because it's focusing more on other things, or there are things that are hindering the agency in terms of decision-making from making progress on these two fronts. The executive committee is the decision-making body of UNHCR, and I think having institutionally, formally having refugees represented in that body, I think we should start there. And we can use the model that is used by the ILO, the International Labour Organization, where it's a multi-stakeholder. There are workers, there are employers, and then other stakeholders. And so if in this body we have a member state represented, we have to have refugees represented too, so that when decisions affecting refugees are made, there are countries there that are autocratic, that have actually made it so hard for refugees to return to their home countries. And I think the dynamic could change a little bit if we have that perspective. So I would start with the executive committee of the UNHCR.
I'm going to just jump in. I mean, the U.S. government hiring is not flexibility, and hiring is not kind of words that are not said together. However, I will say that because of the mission of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, we tend to attract refugees who are on our staff, but not necessarily like all saying, I want to work on policy issues. I have a refugee on my budget team, right? I mean, who just want to, in whatever way they, whatever is the thing that floats their boat, it's just numbers, which is not my forte, but hers it is. So people have come on because they want to contribute to the humanitarian mission and the refugee mission. And we did, and even though I just said that we don't have any flexibility. We have recently brought on several refugees as contractors, and so and which has been extraordinary for us and a great experience. And so this is so even in like the place where you think it's not going to happen, we've been able to make some progress in this as well.
That's great. And that's an example of ways that maybe where it's difficult to hire because of laws or certain policies in place, there are ways to get around that through contractor or other opportunities. Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I'll just second John Ton's point, and thank you, Maureen. I agree. It should target UNHCR, and I would say with the Global Refugee Forum coming up, we could demand that they set a target for XCOM for their global staff. There's a lot of movement in UNHCR staff, and I think it's very possible.
Thank you, Maureen, for your question. We have one over here. Sarah? Yes. And then I'll go to you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm with Refuge Point, and I'm the head of our development team. And so one of the things that I think, we have a lot of capacity in development. And when we are applying to foundations, it's often a steep climb. It takes a long time, a lot of capacity to get grants. And so I'm curious, Sarah, maybe you are best to answer this, but to hear from others as well. If we're trying to shift, some of this funding so that it's going to refugee-led organizations who do not have these big development teams that have the time and energy and capacity to really put together, very detailed proposals for restricted funding. I'm curious if you're seeing at Hilton and in other foundations a move towards more trust-based philanthropy with RLOs, or if there is this expectation that RLOs will need to go through this same very, I think, complicated isn't the right word, but like more of a complex process with a lot of restrictions for funding.
Yeah, so many things to say. No, I think, first of all, yes, there are foundations that do trust-based philanthropy or give general operating support grants. We are not one of them. Well, we do some of that, but not as much as some others. And I would say it's sort of a trend. There are some foundations that do it and they're really important part of the ecosystem. I would also say, in general, all funders should be less onerous in their requirements. I mean, it just is unnecessary, and usually it's not helpful for the donor either. I would also, and I think this is the most crucial point, is I see no difference in capacity or the ability to apply for a grant between a refugee-led organization and other organizations that have a big fundraising apparatus. Honestly, I think a lot of the big fundraising apparatuses are so divorced from reality that they have a really hard time applying for grants because they don't know what they're talking about and don't demonstrate that they're able to implement a program really well. So they might be able to tick a box very well, but, and I have been part of that apparatus, so I can criticize it maybe. But I think the refugee-led organizations that we've worked with have really the kind of skills and expertise that we are looking for as a donor, and I think other donors are too. I'll just also put a plug in for, there are some really interesting experiments, I would say, going on right now in terms of the infrastructure, though, to support all organizations with fundraising. One of the most frustrating things, I think, for organizations is that they have to use program staff and people who should be responding to a crisis or implementing a program to actually fundraise. And it's outrageous that we, as funders, expect that they're going to take away from the time that they should be spending in communities to write a proposal, and that there isn't funding for fundraising. I think there should be Also, there are interesting models of the back-end support that can come to organizations. So sort of pooling that due diligence process better. And this is, again, where philanthropy can play a really important role in funding those kinds of supports that will make more efficient that due diligence process, so that every single organization isn't checking the same boxes and then having to pay for it out of their program staff time.
Okay. I'm going to go over here and then there. If we have time, I think maybe 5 more minutes.
Hello, my name is Blanche Tax, and I work with UNHCR here in New York. And I'm so pleased to be here, and really glad that you are bringing this truly important conversation to New York. So congratulations on that to begin with. Hearing everything that has been achieved, but hearing mostly so much more to be done. And I really hope that UNHCR in Geneva, but also around the world, can be increasingly a partner in that with you. I want to mention a few things that have happened in UNHCR, examples of change. I hear you that that's not enough, but I still want to mention them because they're part of the journey. So I think the advisory board got mentioned. And of course, an advisory board is not enough, but the advisory board has actually contributed and is contributing to a number of policies. The advisory board of including 16 refugee, internally displaced people, stateless-led organizations, is contributing to policies such as UNHCR's new child protection policy, such as UNHCR's livelihood and economic inclusion strategy, a number of others. This is contribution to real policies. Not enough, but it's a step. The GRF got mentioned, the Global Refugee Forum this year, and a lot of efforts are being made to ensure genuine, meaningful participation, inclusion of refugees in the GRF, the Global Refugee Forum. So some examples. The advisory board that I just mentioned will be participating, will be leading an official event. There has been a call for experts in December of last year, which will result in 70 individual refugee, internally displaced and stateless experts with their lived experience, fully participating in the events of the Global Refugee Forum. There will be 50 forcibly displaced and refugee-led organizations participating in the events of the Global Refugee Forum. And of course, as per the good example of countries like the United States and Canada, other state delegations are strongly encouraged to also include refugees in their delegations. Then the last thing I want to mention is the work that is going on. As I think you all know, the Global Refugee Forum uses pledges, and one of the pledges that is being worked on is the multi-stakeholder pledge on advancing localization in displacement and statelessness responses. The work on this pledge is supported by a group that includes refugee-led organizations, and they are working on 3 thematic areas. One, the funding to local actors with a focus on access, quality, tracking of funding to local actors. Second, 2-way equal capacity sharing with a focus on collaboration, institutional knowledge sharing, and finally, inclusion of local actors in decision-making processes at the level of policy making and operational coordination. Again, hearing you loud and clear, all of these are just steps in a long journey, but I think all of you have been incredibly important in pushing this journey, and I guess the pushing was necessary and remains necessary. So thank you for organizing this event here today, for continuing to push the conversation. And I sincerely hope, for one, that UNHCR at global level, at local level, at regional level will be with you in this process. Thank you.
I think we're at time now, so we're just going to have to end there. But thank you very much for your insightful questions throughout the audience. Thank you for your engagement, and thank you once again for choosing to be here despite all the other places that you could be in this beautiful day in New York City. And look forward to continuing this conversation from Geneva all the way to New York again. Thank you all. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you.
This is the second panel of the morning, called Rethinking Aid Financing, How Locally Led Organizations Are Funding Their Futures. It's presented by the New Humanitarian, START Network, Near Network, and the White Helmets. My name's Erwin Loy. I'm the policy editor at the New Humanitarian. We're a nonprofit newsroom that covers global crises and the people who are trying to respond to them. Just a quick couple of housekeeping things. This event is being live streamed, so hello to everyone watching online. We've got a really tight schedule, about an hour, and a lot to get through. So I'm going to encourage everyone to be quite brief, but I think we'll have time to get to everything, and a bit of time for questions at the end as well. So here in the audience, please think of some of the things you'd like to ask our panelists. And online, please tweet and tag, or X and tag, New Humanitarian. And there's this QR code you can scan behind us, and I'll give you links to all our organizations, and some of the things we talk about will come up, and you can sign up for TNH's weekly newsletter. So just a quick intro to the topic. I don't think anyone here needs a long intro to localization. The reforms have been talked about, underway for years in the aid sector, and there's not been a lot of movement in terms of getting actual power and money closer to the ground. But there are some policy changes, but in practice, I think we all know that things aren't quite moving as fast as people want. But local groups are finding workarounds for a system that's not working as fast as they are. They're finding new donors, new ways of funding. They're collaborating. They're collaborating with each other to share resources as opposed to competing for the same dwindling resources. And they're experimenting with new models of getting funding to the ground faster. So this panel is meant to highlight some of what's going on and talk about what's happening sometimes in the shadows, maybe outside of the spotlight of big aid. We're going to hear how leaders are taking matters into their own hands, and we're going to share some of that knowledge and maybe spark a few ideas. But first, to start us off, I'm going to turn to Marcia Wong, who's the Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Get started, please.
Great, thank you. I've been told by Erwin I must use the mic. Does this work? No? Darn it. Okay, so I do need to use the mic. Darn it. Thank you, Erwin, and good morning, everyone. And it is a real pleasure to see all of you in real life and in good health. And also, thank you to all the virtual participants who are beaming in today, too. It is an honor and a privilege to be on the stage with many of these colleagues who I know the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance has had some long and strategic engagements and partnerships with. And we will continue to learn from all of you on what is a very critical topic at a critical time. I have a feeling that there are many in this room who may be working 24/7 now on the truly tragic events that took place in Morocco and Libya in the last week. And we are still continuing to work on the global protracted crises, the climate shocks, and the long-term humanitarian and development challenges. So critical topic, critical time. What I wanted to be able to do is tell you a little bit, if I may, on, first of all, let me assure you that BHA is fully aware how difficult it is. And we need to take on the responsibility of being one of the biggest donors in humanitarian assistance to make it less difficult to have funding going to the local organizations. Even this morning, if you can bear with me, and Erwin's going to grab the mic at some point, I was looking through the remarks that were prepared for me, and I felt I need to give you a little bit of a pulse check on where we are. Keep the pressure on us. These conversations actually will do that. Keep the learning going, and keep the reporting and our metrics candid and honest too. Because if we're not hitting it, we're not hitting it. So I wanted to put that out there as a plea to all of you. BHA certainly has a history to build on. We have done, if we may, localization work, particularly in the areas of disaster risk management. Asia and Latin America, Caribbean are really good examples for that. But we know there's urgency behind this, and we have to accelerate those efforts. I think it's useful if I can, because I am going to go to my notes now, because I really want to make sure that you recognize what we're trying to do. I want to do a shout out, if I may, to everybody on this panel and to all of you in the room, because I think you have been no velvet gloves. Some of you have been quite candid and pointed with us on just where the obstacles and impediments are through convenings that have been managed by our colleagues in Interaction and ICVA. The grand bargain process also has put pressure on the system to look at what reforms and revisions, reviews need to accelerate that direct funding to the local organizations. But again, it is certainly not easy at all. I also wanted to add a note to all of this, that it is direct funding, but we also make sure that there's also shared capacity and learning and knowledge built up too. As I was talking with some of our friends here this morning, it would be irresponsible of us as being one of the world's biggest donors to say, here it is, go, without knowing that you have the management and organizational skills to be able to, at the end of the day, help us on the very much needed, very much required need for oversight, accountability, to ensure we have the impact. $1, $1 billion, everything still has to have that sense of oversight, accountability, and impact. But at the same time, we have to make sure that our local partners feel they can do that responsibly with us. So we recognize it is a complex growth path that we all are with each other now at the moment. I also wanted just to point out that, if I may, each donor faces its own constraints and flexibilities that we have. We need to exploit more of those flexibilities. I know all of you certainly recognize that and tell us to. As the world's largest donor, we recognize if we can be more flexible and streamline, what that impact can be, times 100, right? So I wanted to let you know that, and I'm not going to tell you the acronym because it sounds like, I don't know, some sort of bodily function, so I'm not going to tell you what the acronym is, but we are right now undertaking a very, very urgent, critical review and redesign of our processes and systems. It's informed by much of the input from colleagues up here on the stage and with all of you. It is to streamline, it is to accelerate, it is to, if I may, and this is Marcia, if we can, shed the bureaucratic barnacles, is how I look at it. There are things that weigh us down. What can we shed responsibly, but just has accretion over the years? How do we shed the bureaucratic barnacles with the goal and the aim of moving more funding and skill sets out? Importantly in all of this, it's not only just who gets the funding, but also who has the voice. You talked about mic. I can get you to the table, but I got to make sure you got a mic too. And so everything we do, even if it's you to me, to working through an international organization, how do we ensure that, again, the voice and decision making is going to be held primarily in the local hands? So that is a thread that runs through all of our thinking right now. If I can, Erwin, just one more minute, please. Climate finance. That is a big issue for us, a big advocacy point, and again, the impact of that, because when we look at climate impact and climate shocks, who's most likely going to be the first that feel it? It's going to be the local organizations and communities. And if they don't have the resources to step forward fast, or they haven't had the resources to prepare and to mitigate or to adapt, then we are in that doom loop of climate impact on local communities and constantly trying to work together to break that. So I wanted just to point out that climate finance is also an area that we're looking at with a real specific eye and how to move it into the so-called FCV context, but within those contexts to these local communities and truly first responders. So I wanted to just do a little preview, and I wish I were able to announce it, but the lawyers are on me. Last year at the COP, we announced up to $200 million, up to 5-year climate-ready disaster, sorry, I'm going to get that wrong, climate-smart and disaster-ready adaptation initiative. worked with the team, I really insisted that have an intentional focus on local organizations. I hope in the next few months we'll be able to, there we go, there goes the brilliance. I hope in the next few months we'll be able to announce the first round of new local partners. And when we can appropriately, you're going to have to bear with me another minute, where we can appropriately share some of the lessons, the opportunities, but truly some of the challenges to move money to new, perhaps new partners altogether. Not an easy walk, but has to be done. I talked a little bit about, critical topic at a critical time. I talked a little bit about how we all need to ensure as donors the right skill sets, the right responsibilities, the ability to manage it, oversight, and impact. We want to be there with you because we owe each other that. And where we can, again, responsibly, as the biggest donor, where can we shed those bureaucratic barnacles? And then with you all having those right skills, how do we get out of the way? And therefore, getting out of the way, Erwin,
Very
I'm going
good
to do that
segue.
right now.
Great segue.
And turn it over to your panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcia. Thanks for setting us up. We're going to do 2 rounds of quick questions, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So my first question is to Hibak Kalfin, who is the Executive Director for the Network for Empowered Aid Response. Hibak, NEAR is a global South network that has a goal of reshaping aid. So I'm interested in your vision of what is the future of aid financing in an ideal world. What does a better aid financing model look like?
Thank you. Does it work? It does? Okay. Just to say thank you. Thank you for the panel. For us, this process is not from a vacuum. We started in 2016 when we were launched at the World Humanitarian Summit, and very much focused initially on the 25% commitment. And from there, it was, how do we unlock that 25%? And quickly we realized it wasn't just around advocacy, it wasn't around practice reform, but it was around building new solutions. And so we went on a journey for 4 years to try and learn what are the different different local actors doing in different sectors. So we looked into peace building, we looked into development, we looked in community foundations, and we developed a financing strategy. And that financing strategy was, how do we ensure that the system starts to give to organizations, taking into account the capacity and the fact that we're not homogeneous as local organizations. We have organizations within our network who have $50,000 a year budgets and $60 million a year budgets. So very capable of being able to absorb the resources. And over time, I think we started to think through the sector, what it really needed. And interestingly enough, COVID, I think, kicked us a little bit in our backs and made us realize that it needed actual solutions, tangible solutions, to be able to pilot, to be able to scale. And so we started developing local financing mechanisms. We started in Somalia, and that one's very hyper-focused to the communities and how to get informal groups funding directly during response, but also how to build to an agnostic fund that allows to us to respond to the needs of the communities. In Syria, with the recent earthquake, we were able to work with the Syrian National League Network to be able to get money out the door pretty quickly and develop a fund there. We're working in Nepal and with other different groups. And in 2021, we started, with the support of the Hilton Foundation, a change fund, a global fund that allows us to get money out the door to our members in the beginning while we're piloting this within 72 hours. And the most important, I think, component of that, which we're continuing to learn, is around the governance structure. All decisions are made by our members. We have members that have been elected into the governance structure. They make all decisions of which crisis we should support, how we should support it, how much funding we should give. And they are taking a lived experience to take from the panel that we just had on making those decisions. And from there, we were able to get $1.5 million out the door in 67 days. And you can imagine we would have been able, with that same capacity of volunteers and staff within the Secretariat, been able to get $10 million out just in the first year. And so we're on this path of trying to figure out what can we do what kind of infrastructure can we build to be able to get resources to local actors and to be able to have proof of concept for bilateral donors and other donors to be able to get resources to local actors as well.
Thanks, Ibak. I'm going to turn to Christina now to build on some of that. Christina Bennett is the CEO of START Network, which includes dozens of local, national, and international organizations among its membership. Christina, you wrote a piece in the New Humanitarian this year, shameless plug. You said the international aid system is dragged down by its own inertia, while local aid organizations are finding ways around the roadblocks. Can you tell us what are some of the new ways of securing funding that you've seen that really excite you?
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. I'm a last-minute stand-in. We were hoping to have one of our local leaders on this panel, but the U.S. Visa process would have said it otherwise. So here I am, CEO of START Network, a membership organization across the globe of national, international, and local organizations working across 6 continents and through locally led hubs. What we have in common is a vision for changing the humanitarian aid system by shifting power, by shifting resources, by shifting practice so that local organizations can benefit from more and be able to operate more efficiently and more ethically in the crises that we respond to. And importantly, we do all of this through practical action. So like Ibak was saying, you know, we have seen where commitments have fallen short of what people want to see. And so we try to model the change that we want to see by putting into practice different ways of operating, trialing them, evidencing whether they work or not, and then exporting them when they are successful. So the question for this panel is how are local organizations taking matters into their own hands and finding their own funding? And I guess I would say that it's in, you know, we've seen this a lot in START Network, and some of it has to do with money, and some of it doesn't have to do with money. Certainly, our local organizations are raising funds. In Pakistan, for example, the locally led Pakistan hub was able to raise 4 million euros from the German government in anticipation of the catastrophic floods in Balochistan and Sindh province in the summer of 2022. And that's a global level fundraising for a lot of money. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a community-based member in Bangladesh that raised a smaller amount of money from a local bank in order to be able to protect fishermen by giving them food when there was a ban on fishing in their community. And then we have an organization in India that really went after multi-year funding from a UN organization. And in order to do that, worked really hard on developing and improving its financial systems to be able to meet the requirements of that multi-year funding. So now working with a UN agency on that and also working with Google. So what do all of these organizations have in common? They have expertise. Recognized expertise that's recognized by the donors that fund them. And I think it's really important that those donors see the value in that expertise in their own right. What they also have is a real dedication to proving that they are good financial managers. I think one of our humanitarian imperatives is to do really well with money and spend money in the right way. And so what do they, how are they doing this? They are improving their financial systems and demonstrating that they can manage those funds effectively. And third, what do they have? Social capital. Social capital through their networks and their peer groups that they build together. So working together to share learning, to share experiences, to work together to be able to demonstrate financial capabilities and financial support. But I wanted to just make another point about the fact that it's not just money that these organizations are working on. That there's a lot that goes on behind fundraising that local organizations are doing together. One, they are going after quality funding. Quality funding is sustained funding. It is multi-year funding. It is investment in their organizations. And they're doing that, again, by demonstrating that they are good financial managers and really spending time and money to be building up their financial systems and improving that, so demonstrate their financial capabilities. They are also advocating for their own visibility and their own credibility by going to global forums to talk about their work. So our hub in Pakistan led our work and our advocacy at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, talking about their responses to the floods. We had 2 of our local leaders from the Democratic Republic of Congo and from South Sudan at the Africa Regional Climate Week last week, talking about their work. And we have our partner in Guatemala, in ASEXA, talking at ADEX about the work that they're doing with community innovation there. All three of those opportunities led to direct conversations with funders. So it's not all about money, it's about what happens behind the money that local organizations are doing in spades. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina, especially for wrapping that up in a succinct 5 minutes. I'll turn right now to Degan Ali. She's the executive director of ADESO, a Kenya-based humanitarian and development organization. Degan, ADESO is in the middle of developing the Proximate Fund for Africa. The idea is that it will be a $1 billion pool of funding that can fund local civil society organizations at scale. I think you and ADESO push for transformational change in your work. I'm wondering, what do you think makes this transformational? What makes it different from what exists today?
Yeah, I think what Hibak talked about is, the idea that we as the Global South have to come up with our own solutions to our own problems. And we're trying to do that. And we're trying to be propositional and coming up with new ideas constantly. And so there is a recognition and appreciation that intermediation needs to happen. The issue is not intermediation, it's the quality of the intermediation and where decision and power lies in that intermediation. Are you going to be making decisions in DC or the Bay Area, or are you making decisions in DRC on which civil society organizations actually get money in that country? And so with the Proximate Fund in Africa, it's just a natural follow-up to the Change Fund, where we're saying in Africa, why can't we do a big bet philanthropy? We're not really focusing on the bilaterals, but it can be a solution later to the bilaterals. And I think this is where philanthropy is really important, because they can take the risk and de-risk it for bilaterals and take that first step in making things happen. And so we are designing a fund that is doing a couple things. One, we want to fund the invisible organizations, that not the donor darlings that everybody talks about when they come to Kenya, not the guys that can absorb a $5 million grant. We are talking about small CBOs at $5,000 grant is impactful grant size. To the $1 million. There are medium-sized organizations that can easily absorb $1 million that are still fairly invisible. So we're looking at those small to medium-sized organizations. That's one. Secondly, we're looking at funding at the national level. So I'm sitting in Kenya. I can't make decisions for South African civil society organizations about their priorities. And while we are a Pan-African fund, we also need to practice what we preach and democratize and decentralize decision-making. So what we want to do is fund existing national infrastructure. So if there's a civil society-led fund, like in Ghana, there's Star Ghana, we would work with Star Ghana and give them the money, and the Ghanaian NGOs make a decision about who they fund, how much to absorb, all of that, whether to give them a $5,000 grant or a $100,000 grant. So this link to that is we want to develop infrastructure where it doesn't exist. So a place like Chad, there is no, as far as we know now, there isn't a civil society-led fund. So we would work with Near Network to work with our members in Chad to help develop a civil society fund in Chad. So infrastructure building is really, really important. Why do we have small, really localized community foundations all over the North? And we don't think that that should be the norm in the South. That's what we should be thinking about, not only about a Nairobi, a Kenyan-led fund, but a Nairobi fund, a Kakuma fund, a Kisumu fund, a Garissa fund. I mean, these things should be existing. And so that's where we want to get to eventually. We're not there yet, but we should say that the infrastructure we have invested in and built over the past 50 years in the global North, that level of investment is needed also in the South. And then third, they're recognizing that there are resources in the South, and that's why we want to invest in this infrastructure. So we would go to the KCDF, the Kenyan Community Development Foundation in Kenya, and say, hey, there's a drought in Kenya that's happening. Go raise money from the public and the private sector. For every dollar you raise, the Proximate Fund would match it. So the idea is mobilize and help leverage our resources to mobilize more local philanthropy. And lastly, de-risk African billionaires and millionaires by saying we've already have money from Global North Philanthropy. You in Nigeria or in South Africa, why don't you put some money into this pot to support your South African civil society or your Nigerian civil society? So we are also trying to work with African Philanthropy Forum as a strategic partner in addition to NEAR to help us mobilize African philanthropy, both at the local level, small donors, but also large level.
Thanks, Tegan. I want to come back to you later about the difference in the focus on philanthropic donors. I think that's really interesting. But we'll move on first to Farouk, who's sitting to my right. Farouk Habib is the Deputy General Manager and Head of External Affairs with the White Helmets, which of course is a volunteer-led organization that emerged in Syria, largely as rescue teams, but you've changed a lot over the years. So Farouk, the White Helmets have evolved to become a locally led organization that receives funding from major donors. Can you tell us a bit about the process of building that up, about securing that funding, and what sort of, I suppose, trade-offs are required when you're dealing with the traditional humanitarian donors, or in what ways do they change to meet your needs?
Hi everyone, thank you for joining. Well, it has been a long journey indeed. We, the local civil defense teams started in Syria in 2012 as grassroots groups in different parts, not connected, not well organized. And gradually, by 2013, we had different bodies of coordination at provincial or regional levels. Then by end of 2014, for the first time, we had the first General Assembly meeting for leaders from every part of Syria, and they formed the national umbrella, which was led in the beginning just by a coordination committee, so it wasn't a full merge. But then over the following years, these regional bodies were merged, and gradually you had one homogeneous national organization leading the emergency response, search and rescue, and a lot of health activities in the region. At the same time, we've been developing our partnerships with our donors and supporters globally. And what we've learned through this process that it's not necessarily about having direct funding. It's about having direct relationship, direct partnership, getting your voice heard, and having reliable partners who can also support with the advocacy, and you can outsource many of the services and needs you have to get that consolidated. Not all donors were receptive in the beginning, but we knew that we have a homework on our side as well, and we need to overcome any pre-assumptions or judgments, and we need to prove ourselves. And we got a lot of support from our people first, and from the public globally, which helped us to make that change.
Can I ask you quickly, since you responded so quickly, can you talk about what those assumptions are from donors' perspectives? Like, what did you have to prove to them, and how do you go about doing that?
Well, there is that pre-assumption that local organizations cannot do the same job as Western organizations. Yeah, that exists. We cannot deny it. And we proved the opposite. And it's not about the nationality or the color of the people who are managing these funds. It's about the system. And we proved our legitimacy. So donors, when they talk to the White Helmets, they know that they are not talking to a traditional NGO which is looking for funding for its project. They talk to a legitimate civil society group, a leading actor on the ground representing their communities. So that's very important, because donors, especially when we talk about government donors, they keen also to make sure that their support is relevant, and it also meets expectations of their public. So we provide them with that assurance. Again, it wasn't easy. It wasn't the same process with every donor and with every partner. but I believe to a large extent we have overcome these three assumptions, and we've been reasonable and understandable. We knew that we will face these barriers from the beginning, and we need to be patient. We shouldn't rush.
Thank you, Farouk. We'll come back and talk more about that. I'd like to turn to my left to Rory Stewart. Thanks for joining us from the next room. I hope that podcast went well. Looking forward to that. Rory is president of the Give Directly, which is, of course, is a poverty reduction, has a goal of poverty reduction largely through direct cash transfers. Previously, Rory held several roles in the UK government, including Secretary of State for International Development, which I think is quite relevant to this conversation. Rory, we're hearing about all these challenges and opportunities for local organizations, and essentially they're looking for workarounds for a system that hasn't changed very fast when it comes to localization. I'm wondering, from your time in government, can you tell us how donor governments view localization, what people are talking about here, how they view it, and how that's changed?
Well, I think it's a hugely difficult problem. I think we have to be honest about the fact that international development organizations remain surprisingly old-fashioned and rigid. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of good chat, but the truth is that they've been doing things in a certain way for 70 years, and they find it bureaucratically very difficult to change. I mean, some thoughts in relation to what we're talking about today. I think that the first thing is we really must put recipients first. And we need to drive this conversation through the question of what the interests of the recipients, the interests of the extreme poor are, rather than the question of the interests of the development agencies or the particular NGOs. And we have to be very rigorous in assessing what the impact is on the extreme poor, how much actually reaches them and how much their lives are changed. And we need to find ways of continuing to invest in randomized control trials and other forms of really assessing rigorously what actually happened through this intervention. I think there's no doubt at all that the current situation is absurd. There is a completely surreal gap between the global north and the global south. It is mad. It's mad to imagine a situation in which $200 billion a year is spent by people who have often only the most imperfect understanding of what is actually going on the ground, who are imposing one-size-fits-all theories on communities and structures which they have very little contact with. That cannot be the right way to do things. The right way, of course, to approach this kind of problem, particularly when you're dealing with communities whose lives are very, very difficult, very alien, very remote, is to get decision-making down to the lowest possible level. So a lot of this is about a theory of decentralization. It's about taking power away from centers and driving power down to a local level. In doing that, we need to think, I think, about three things. We need to think about subsidiarity, we need to think about accountability, and we need to think about cost. What do I mean by subsidiarity? By subsidiarity, I mean literally drive it down to the lowest possible level. Right? The solution to people in New York or Washington or London or Paris dealing with a problem in Eastern Congo is not to simply replace that with somebody sitting in the capital city in Western DRC speculating about what's happening in Eastern DRC. The fact that you are a national is not sufficient. You need people who are much, much, much closer to these communities. So driving down to the lowest possible level is absolutely vital. Second question is a question of accountability. And in honor of the SDGs, what I'm talking about here is not unique to international development. This is true in British government, right? The truth is that a community on the Scottish-English border knows more, cares more, can do more than a distant official sitting in London. And the solution to that is not to simply move power from London to Manchester, it's to move power closer to that community on the English-Scottish border. Again, in the British context, the second point of that is accountability. It's not enough to say some local institution on the English-Scottish border is responsible. Is that institution, they may be local, is it accountable? And how does it actually control its revenue? Because money is often power in these contexts. If the money is coming from somewhere else, it's very, very difficult for that local organization to have full accountability or responsibility for its expenditure. How do we hold that organization to account if, as often happens with local organizations in Britain, they are not performing efficiently and effectively for those communities? And the final thing is cost. We can waste an enormous amount of money involved in trying to create ever more perfect programs through ever more detailed consultations, ever more detailed needs assessments, ever more complex procurement mechanisms, ever more complex monitoring and evaluation to try to ensure we're doing exactly the right thing. But when I was the Secretary of State in DFID, I saw programs in which $40,000 for a water sanitation program in a Zambian school resulted in $2,000 being spent on 2 latrines and 5 red plastic buckets. The other $38,000 had been absorbed in the needs assessments, the consultations, the procurement mechanisms. It is beyond imagination. And the question we need to ask, not just for international organizations, but local organizations, is, and this is where I'm going to plead special interest, I believe in many cases, the most radical form of decentralization is not to move from the international to the local, but it is to give unconditional cash to the individual in that community. Instead of wasting money on needs assessing them, consulting them, pretending you understand the culture of a village on the Burundi-Rwanda border, really say, actually, each individual need in each individual house is different. You may wish to start a small business, you may wish to fix your roof, you may wish to buy livestock, you may wish to get your kids back into school. No organization, international, local, is going to be able to answer those questions for you. The most radically respectful thing we can do is to get out the way, give unconditional cash, and let people address their own needs directly.
Thanks, Rory. Coincidentally, some of that is what Give Directly does, which I suppose is not a coincidence. We'll come back to interrogate.
I work for an organization I believe in. I don't want to apologize for that.
We'll come back to talk about some of what you raised shortly. I'd like to turn back to Hibak to talk about collaboration. You spoke of that earlier as an important part of the way you see the future. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I should say, with NEAR being a network of over 280 organizations, it's really important that I talk about, I think, the role that the Secretariat plays. And we play 3 functions. The first function is as a facilitator, the second is as a convener, and the third is as an advisor. And decisions are made by our members. And so when we think about any of our solutions or any of our approaches, we think about it in a collaborative way. And to start, we work similar to, I think, what Christina said and Farouk said. It's not just about money, it's about representation, it's about power. And so we focus on 2 separate areas. We focus on policy influencing and we focus on financing. From the Change Fund and a little bit of what Degan said, we've been challenged by our members. We've been challenged by our members to think beyond one fund. We've been challenged to think reimagining the system. And so what we've been able to do, I think, over the last couple of months is have some really hard conversations with our members, with our partners, with our allies, of what a collaborative networked financing system or mechanism could look like. And for us, there are, I think, a few things that are really, really important for us to stress. And it's a little bit about what Rory just said. It's about agency. It's about ensuring that the organizations who mostly are part of the communities have the agency to make a decision of what kind of funding their community needs, especially in a response. The second is to center everything that we do, I think, around local leadership. We're not going to move towards the 25% without centering local actors within the new system. And then third, I think what we've been able to do, and this is why we purposefully have only taken foundation money in the beginning, is be very flexible and adaptable. To be able to say, here is the criteria, but we should be able to move around, and not from a due diligence perspective, but from an implementing perspective. And so all of those areas that we've been able to learn over the last couple of years would not have happened unless we had members in 29 countries, unless we had partners in 39 countries that felt like they had a voice within the network to be able to say, these are the things that we want to be changed immediately, in the midterm and in the long term. And that's kind of the ethos and the essence of the way that NEAR Network works.
Thanks, Hibak. Dagan, let's turn to you. Again, about philanthropic donors. Why are you so heavily focused on philanthropic donors as opposed to the traditional bilateral donor government grants?
I think as a DESO, we have gone through a transition. When I first came in 2003 to the organization that was founded by my mother, Fatima Jibril, my hope and aspiration was to get bilateral funding. And that's what I worked really hard for, and eventually we succeeded. We got EU funding, we got USAID funding, we got Swedish funding, we got all types of funding. And we were probably the only Somali NGO that had broken through the glass ceiling and actually gotten this kind of funding. At the height of ADESO, I think in 2011, 2012, we had about $20 million in annual income. And then we made a massive pivot as a result of a few experiences that we had to saying, while we are doing advocacy as ADESO with the Grand Bargain and Localization and the World Humanitarian Summit, and we led that movement on the 25%, that funding is going to take a long time. It's like steering and moving the Titanic. It's not an easy change. Samantha Power, I take my hat off to her. What she's trying to do is amazing, and we love that leadership that she's providing with other bilaterals, and I hope that they are actually following in her footsteps, because the target of 25% has died, and she's put some life into it as a result of her recommitment. But I also know, as a recipient of USAID funding, how difficult it is to manage that grants. And I would probably, if I could go back in time, I actually might have said to an INGO, you be the pass-through, and you take that risk and you manage it, and let me just do my work and get on with it. But that was a painful lesson learned, and but it was a really important lesson for me, because I realized that the machinery is such that people are handicapped by Congress. There are rules and regs there for a reason, and making a small little change to one policy might require some legislative support and a bill or something like that. It's not so easy. And I was just very naive, thinking they could change this or change that procurement policy or whatever, but it's not that easy. And once you understand and unravel this onion, you just start peeling and peeling and peeling. It's never ending. And so we realized that philanthropy, honestly, is flexible. Much of it is unrestricted. Philanthropy has led the charge in trust-based philanthropy. We know what Mackenzie Scott has done in terms of giving large size, unrestricted, purely unrestricted funding to Global South organizations, not just BIPOC groups in the US, but globally, including ADESO, that I was shocked to receive. We received a Mackenzie Scott grant. And I was expecting that there would be all types of restrictions. There was 0 restrictions. And I was like, wait a minute, you can buy land? They were like, yep. I was like, you can do investments? Yep. And you're like, wait, you don't want any reports? Just 1 report a year. And then they discontinued the report. So now actually I want a relationship with them, and I can't even talk to them. I want to report. I want to tell them this is all the amazing things that you guys have, your money has done. So it's like, it's the extreme of trust. You know what you're doing. We don't need a reporting. We don't need accountability. Go on with your business. Bye. You know what it's called? It's not called a grant. It's called a gift. And honestly, it feels like a gift. One day I was reflecting on that word, what it means, the difference between a grant and a gift. And it feels like a gift, because it feels like I'm giving you money. When you give sadaqah in Islamic terms, when you give charitable giving, you don't sit there and try to micromanage what that person does with the gift that you've given them. You're trusting them. And so that is where philanthropy, with the example of Mackenzie Scott, they're not all like Mackenzie Scott, but they are far, far more flexible. And I think this is the role that philanthropy can play, is de-risking things that are very innovative, that are very outside the box kind of thinking that we are constantly coming up with. Local organizations might be under-resourced, but they are not undercapacitated with ideas. We are constantly innovating. We're constantly innovating. People talk about innovation left, right, and center, and the people that innovate the most are the resource-strapped communities. When you have a lot of resources, you don't innovate. When you have no resources, you're constantly innovating. And so that is where philanthropy can come in as a real partner to say, we'll take the risk, we'll de-risk it for you, we'll help you establish this fund, we'll take that leap of faith, we'll help you raise the resources for this proximate fund, we'll help you give seed funding or design funding, and all of that bilaterals can't do. And then later, we can go to USAID and say, hey, are you ready to be a partner in this $200 million fund that philanthropy has already invested in? And so, and we have a track record of giving. We have some metrics to show you. They have accountability to the people, the taxpayers. We understand that. So we will give you that track record, those metrics, but we can only do that with the initial investment for philanthropy. And that's why I think philanthropy is so critical to the ecosystem.
Thanks, Dagan. Farouk, I'm going to turn to you quickly. Are there things from the White Helmet experience that when it comes to finding funding, that you think other organizations can learn from?
Direct funding, you mean?
Any sort of funding.
Well, of course, a lot of lesson learns. A lot of lesson learns, but building on what I believe our key success factors and key challenges we have overcome, we learned that we need always to maintain our legitimacy and relevance. So I would advise to other local organizations, don't rush, don't be hasty, you have to be patient, build your capacity, don't follow the money. It's not that whatever funding opportunity you may have, you grab it. No, you should stay relevant to your cause, to your mission, and within your capacity to absorb funds. Build coalition. It helps a lot. You need the economy of scale. A single small local organization will never be able to meet all the donors' requirements. It's so sophisticated. They require too many staff and overheads. So it's much better for small organizations to work together, have a coalition that might do the admin work while they focus on the technical service delivery. And of course, stay working hard on institutional capacity building, finance, governance, compliance. I know my colleagues talked already about them. But I think one of the important lessons we learned that we should remain open and diverse in our own building and structure. A local organization doesn't need to be always only local staff. So we are very proud of our model and experience of having people from different countries, different backgrounds, different places working together for a joint cause that, yes, it came from the ground, from the field in Syria. But we needed to share experience, and we have people from everywhere working together, and that helps to build that bridge to the international community and the external donors.
Thanks, Farouk. Christina, I'll turn quickly to you, then over to Rory briefly. Rory talked about some of the inefficiencies in the system, and when we're talking about localization, we're talking about rectifying power imbalances. But how do you make sure those imbalances just aren't transferred to a different level? How do you make sure those inefficiencies don't get replicated just in a different model?
So maybe that was loud. So maybe two things. I think I'll go back to the first point, the point that Hibak was making, and something that we very much subscribe to at Start Network around collaboration, because I think, power is a human trait. Taking power is a human trait, and I think you can get caught in a cycle of shifting power to different parts of the system, but not dispersing power or sharing power. So I think the concept of collaboration, the concept of building social capital, is the concept of collaboration over competition, I think, is something that that you can use to share that power, and not to merely devolve it down to different levels. In Start Network, for example, we talk a lot about sharing power and sharing risk. On sharing power, we lobby with, all members lobby with one another to share their indirect cost recovery. So share the money that they get for their overheads in order to adopt a model where it's the tide, getting money is the tide that lifts all boats. We get money for our organization, you get money for your organization, and together we mount a response that is that much more effective, that much more ethical, that much more efficient. We talk about sharing risk, and I think I'm glad that, Dagan, you brought up the concept of risk in your working with philanthropy, because I think in a conversation about humanitarian financing, to avoid the topic of risk is to avoid the big elephant in the room. I think, our current approaches to risk, whether you're talking about an institutional donor like USAID or a philanthropic organization, not all of them are like Mackenzie Scott's, you are talking about a model of risk that hobbles local organizations, and to me is the single largest impediment to getting financing closer to the ground or on the ground as quickly as possible. Risk and compliance measures are overly bureaucratic. They're very, very expensive, and they operate based on a model, not the model that Farouk is talking about in terms of what do you see, what do organizations have to bring to the table, but really about what organizations lack in terms of their ability to accommodate your needs as a donor. And so I think if there are funders in this room, and I know that there are a few, I think the greatest thing that you can do to improve this conversation is to really overhaul your approach to risk, accountability, and compliance. And do it through the lens of, I guess, what I would call proportionality, simplicity, and creativity. And you heard a lot about what that looks like in practice from Dagan, but I mean, proportionality is really about looking at your compliance systems and what you need to know from the organizations that you fund. Calibrate that with the size of the organization and align it with the amount of money they're asking for, and get rid of everything else that you're not ever going to look at or use, because it just puts a burden on those organizations that could be doing much better work through their operations. In terms of simplicity, if an organization has already passed a due diligence through one of your peer organizations, why would you put them through that again to spend the money, to do the work? Simplify it. Trade information with that peer organization, passport that information to your own due diligence, and accept it as given, and share that information so that others can do the same. And then creativity. I think a lot of donors would require some reporting, but it doesn't always have to be the 30-page report or the log frame that everybody insists on when reporting on funds. What if you sat down with the community and asked them, did you get the money that you needed, and did it go to the right things? What if you reported through video testimonials? What if you reported through quiet conversations? I don't think everything has to be as onerous and as expensive as it is. If your organization does require that level of compliance, then fund your organizations in order to be able to meet those compliance standards, including the intermediary organizations that may be taking on some of that burden. And then finally, just talk to your organizations about the value they bring, not the deficits they have, because funding organizations is not riskier, it's just different. And the evidence bears that out, and my experience at Start Network bears that out too. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Rory, I'll turn quickly to you. You've heard a lot about some of these ideas, and a lot of these things are not new. There are things people have been asking for years. From your time in government, I'm wondering how does any of this get through? Is any of it realistic? Is there an appetite to do the things that people are asking for?
I think the first thing to bear in mind, of course, with the government is that you are very, very much conscious that you're spending money from taxpayers, and you are subject to a very hostile, increasingly populist, increasingly isolationist media environment. Things are worse now than they were 10, 15 years ago. Aid budgets are being cut in Britain, they're being cut in Sweden, they're being cut in Northern Europe, they're likely to be cut in the United States. We do not have populations that are keen to give money to other people. The 0.7% target is fading. The global commitment to addressing extreme poverty is much less strong than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Civil society movements, churches, trade unions are weaker than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So the context is not good. And this is a problem because it means that you are dealing with publics who are deeply, deeply skeptical about aid expenditure. Everybody in this room, I think, I would hope, agrees very strongly that we should be localizing aid much more. I think localizing not just to national NGOs, but to the most local possible NGOs, and I believe, obviously, actually down to individuals themselves. But the biggest challenge that we face is that inevitably there are going to be scandals. There are going to be big, big scandals. Increasing number of the world's poor live in fragile, conflict-affected states. Everybody in this room should know that an enormous amount of aid money goes missing, and we don't report on it, and we're not transparent about it. But eventually, media, press find out about it. And there will be scandals of abuse. Recipient safeguarding will not be upheld in many cases. Money will be stolen. Ludicrous programs will be designed with good intentions, with very, very few impacts on the ground. And that will get back to media and voters at home. So I would seriously say that we have to be, and this is where I'm slightly pushing back against some of the narratives in the room, the way to make this transition is to hold the local organizations to very, very high standards for their own sake. The only way that we will be able to make this transition is if we can demonstrate that local organizations are at least as effective. I would argue must be more effective. I mean, the argument for local organizations has to be that they know more, care more, can do more. So we need to be able to demonstrate through randomized control trials that more of the money given to the local organization arrives on the ground with the recipient than is the case for an international organization. We need to be very, very careful to make sure that they are protected, unfortunately, against fraud, against sexual abuse. And I'm worried that trying to get rid of some of the bureaucracy may end up causing a problem which we don't want, which is a rapid amount of money flowing into local organizations without the appropriate compliant mechanisms in place. If it then results in scandals, will put this whole movement back 5 or 10 years. So I would argue for absolutely demonstrating that local organizations are cleaner, better, more accountable, more effective than the international organizations, and making sure that they're judged on those metrics, not on the fact that they're local.
I would wonder about the cost of doing this, and there has been that research for several years now, and it's really hard to compare across countries, across contexts. But I want to flip some of those points back to anyone on this panel. Do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I would like to respond to that. Sorry, Rory. I have to push back. My first experience with fraud was with a UN staffer. Okay, in Somalia.
The international community steals money, wastes money. I'm not denying that.
But this is a narrative I've been hearing for 20 years. Honestly, black and brown people always steal, are risky. I'm sick of it. I'm sorry.
Can I be very clear, because that is absolutely not what I'm saying. I began by saying the international community is corrupt, inefficient, ineffective. The global north wastes money, steals money, squanders money.
Okay.
But we live in an international context in which that, in a populist environment, is very, very sensitive.
Yeah.
And what we cannot allow is the other narrative to develop, and we have to protect against it.
So what I would like to say, what I'm going to give you is a live example of what happened. We reported a fraud scandal with a local NGO that was a sub to us. in Somalia in 2011. We kind of whistle blew on ourselves and said this local NGO, every single INGO that we know, including UNICEF, was partnering with them. So we assumed it's a famine, everybody has to move fast. We had a gun held to our head by donors saying it's a famine, move the money, burn it, burn it, burn it. And so we partnered with this organization, not doing proper due diligence because of speed, assuming all these INGOs and UN agencies had done due diligence. We partnered with them, found out there was fraud. I, being very naive, went to the international community and said, yeah, there was fraud. We investigated it, we admitted it. We thought we would be applauded. Good job, Degen, for being honest, right? You know what happened to Adesso? We were blacklisted. Adesso was blacklisted. Simultaneously, an INGO, I will not name names, had a massive fraud scandal, much larger in scale than us, much larger. Okay, you know what happened to them? The donors worked really hard backstage to hide their fraud and not let it become public and not get it into the Guardian and the New York Times. And their funding actually like quadrupled in Somalia, quadrupled. So let's just be honest here, okay? There's a couple of issues. One, the proportion of risk is different. When you are giving 99% or more of your funding to UN agencies and INGOs, the risk factor is much higher with international agencies. We get a little bit, we get like a drop, right? So even if we steal all of it, the proportion of the risk is much higher with them. That's the reality, right? The second reality is that the international donors are in cahoots with the UN and the INGOs to ensure that there is no repercussions for these entities. And what happened in Somalia, not only did it affect Adesso being blacklisted, all local NGOs, we were all guilty by association by the mere fact that we were all local in Somalis. We couldn't be trusted. So funding for local NGOs in Somalia went down significantly because of that one incident. And you know what I was told by an INGO country director? I sat with him and I said, hey, we investigated, we found this out. I want to go public with it. He told me, don't do it. They can hide it. That's what he told me. And I said, what? We all know there's some fraud happening. We all know there's problems happening. Why don't we all bring it up? And if you talk about it, I talk about it, everybody talks about it, then maybe we'll finally get to the root of the problem and clean the house. No, he was like, I'm sorry to say you're being very naive. And I was extremely naive. I was shocked by the reaction. But that is systematically what happens.
But I couldn't agree more. And I think just to clarify, the point that I'm making is about the domestic political context.
Yes.
Right? It's very, very difficult to get voters in Europe and North America to put money into international development. And the problem isn't the reality. You're absolutely right. The reality is that the UN agencies, the international NGOs, are responsible for far more of the fraud and the waste than any local NGO ever. But we are in an environment which is extremely hostile to international development. And so it is extremely important for the sake of protecting the brand that we don't take shortcuts. And this is where I'm slightly pushing back on your point. I totally agree with you. But remember, there's a contradiction between the two of you. You talked about the fact that effectively you had passported a local NGO that had been endorsed by an international NGO that was giving it money over to yourself, and you found that they were involved in fraud. One of the reasons why I think that we have to, unfortunately, even though it's expensive, do quite complex compliance mechanisms for local NGOs as well as international, is just to protect people from the political fallout.
But maybe if I could respond too. I think what we're not saying, well, what I'm not saying at least, is that it is not our responsibility to be good with money. It is not our responsibility to get money on the ground where it's needed. I think that is one of our humanitarian imperatives, along with helping people and protecting people from suffering. But I think what I am saying is that we have to take a measure of proportionality here. We have to look at, as Dagan was saying, we have to look at the risk that we're looking at and react in proportionate ways. We cannot put undue burdens on organizations, hold them to a higher standard. Why should we hold them to a higher standard? Why shouldn't we hold everybody to the same standard, or to a standard that is proportionate to the risk that they pose? This is not to say that good financial management is not important, that fraud is not a red line. It's just that look at what you're asking people to do, and isn't their time and their money and their effort and their creativity and ingenuity better spent working on behalf of people in crisis and not working in back offices to service the British public that is maybe not, that doesn't feel that they should be defunding international aid. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Marcia, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, waiting in the middle of this. And also because I have to slip out and run up the street to the next meeting, of course, but truly, really, respect and appreciate the candor and how the ball is being lobbed back and forth across the net here. So thank you. And, what a searing journey this is, right? I mean, everyone is still, learning as we go. And thank you, just kind of remembering where we were 12 years ago on this topic to where I think we are today, for better or for worse. More easy to describe the development budgets, the humanitarian assistance budgets, which have always been pretty robust because, at least in the United States, there is a bipartisan effort to alleviate suffering, save lives. That has been sort of a common shared goal. But when you put it in some of these contexts, boy, does it become highly political, right? And I think we, as at least from the humanitarian point of view, as principled humanitarian response, got to protect the local actors too from that scrutiny. So maybe it does translate into help me make your best arguments. So what can I hear from you? What can you show me in terms of metrics to know that we can invest in you? So it may be seen as onerous and burdensome, but it's part of the building the defensive structure. I know.
Then pay for it, then help them pay for it.
Well, that's what I'm saying, and that's what I was talking about in my remarks was, whatever we give you in terms of funding has to be accompanied with the ability to manage, the ability to account for it, and we can do all the overheads and this and that, but it's it is irresponsible for us to be giving anybody resources and then walk away. I mean, ideally, yes, but it's but if I'm not confident that, if there was an audit, you would pass, it's on me too. That's what I'm saying, is shared responsibility, successes and risks. Let's talk about that. So I hear you on these. The one thing, though, I did want to say, because also it's a little bit those big agencies get to take the walk. Not so much now. We have seen, obviously, with the unfortunate cases, and it's in the media, so Marcia's not giving away a secret here, the unfortunate cases of diversion in the Horn of Africa. There are some really tough and raw conversations taking place with those UN agencies now. With their systems, their processes, our systems, our processes. So that is a little bit of that internal review. So please, be assured there is a scrub going on that at the end of the day, it's not the local organization that's 100% culpable or vulnerable. There are others that play in this ecosystem, and they have to hold themselves to these high standards too. So the tough conversations are at all levels now, for better or for worse. But again, I appreciate just the willingness of the candor of this conversations, because all this has to go into what we're doing next. So keep investing in the conversations and dialogues with us, please. Again, there is this internal process, which I will not give you the acronym, but there's urgency behind it. There is scrutiny on it internally, and we have expectations on this thing. And I just have to make sure it really delivers for everybody.
Thanks,
so thank
Marcia.
you. Got to run.
Thank you. Farouk, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, has been an interesting discussion, just pressing on the shared responsibility for Masha, because mistakes will happen, definitely, no matter how much due diligence we do. Mistakes may happen, but donors should share responsibility when that mistake is because of their short-term planning, lack of capacity building, lack of core support for sustainability, whatever, because these smaller organizations, they don't have the capacity exactly to fill all the gaps. There will be mistakes, of course, but no donors need to be brave to recognize what led to that mistake, why this happened. Because that organization was not able to hire competent staff or to work on their capacity or have longer-term planning and internal procedures. Because, all these resources, which are traditionally allocated to cover these gaps, goes to the international partner, while the local organizations are left alone, but they take the highest risk. So when mistakes happen, donors also should share the responsibility for it.
Thanks for speaking of risk sharing, and thanks, Marcia. Speaking of risk sharing, Rory, you spoke about this need to shield local NGOs. Is there, as Give Directly, you've also weathered storms in terms of aid diversion recently. Is there something that an organization like Give Directly or someone in your position can do, or something concrete to share that risk with local organizations?
Well, it's a very interesting question. So we've just been through a scandal in DRC, so Eastern DRC, and just to quickly talk you through what happened. And this relates, I think, to a bigger problem in the industry. So this is a very bad conflict-affected area of Eastern DRC, and we decided on security grounds that recipients would not have to register their own mobile telephones. Instead, staff would do it for them. Over the course of 14 months, our staff proceeded to steal the money that was supposed to be going to recipients. They effectively helped themselves to the SIM cards that were meant to be in the hands of recipients, and they paid themselves instead of paying the recipients. And we've had a sort of fascinating journey on this because, of course, we began by saying, look, this is only 0.6% of our expenditure last year. We spent $200 million last year. This was about $900,000. And do we really want to put in many more procedures and spend more money preventing the fraud than we actually lost in the fraud? In the end, we've decided, yes, we do want to spend more money preventing the fraud than we lost in the fraud because the trust that you have in receiving money from other people is very sacred. And sometimes it is justified to spend more money preventing losing money that you actually would lose in the money. What have we learned through this process? Well, I think the first thing, and this is why maybe I'm sort of sharing this, the damage to our organization is intense. Right? We can provide any number of explanations for why we made a particular exception in Eastern DRC and why things went wrong. The truth of the matter is it is deeply, devastatingly damaging to an organization to lose money. It's also true, as Degan says, as soon as we found out the fraud, we published it on the blog. We went out to journalists. We gave an immediate exclusive to the new Humanitarian. We did nothing to hide it. And of course, we feel a little bit bitter about sitting in organizations with international NGOs where they look around the table and say, what's your fraud and diversion rate? And we say 0.6%. And all the most famous NGOs in the world say 0%, right, all the way around the table. Okay, so it's a very, very weird ecosystem. But all I can say is that my lesson from this is if you're doing something radical, as we are with direct cash transfer, or as the localization agenda is doing, right, doing something that is challenging the system, you have to be that much more careful because people are gunning for you. They're going to jump on the first possible opportunity to say, oh, well, that's why we should return to the old system. And that's why you have to be even more careful. And I think I'm going to be quiet, but I mean, I think if I had one message that I'd want to get across, it's in the end, this is all about recipients first. The danger of this conversation is we're talking about the intermediary organizations. In the end, the only question really that matters is what is in the best interest of recipients. And I believe strongly that local organizations are much more likely to deliver good, efficient outcomes for recipients. But that's the way in which they should be judged.
Can I just ask you, Rory, a question? As a result of that experience in DRC, did your funding decrease?
Yes, yeah.
Like what percentage?
Difficult to assess, but definitely there are donors who were about to sign contracts who did not sign contracts. There will be other people that it's difficult to assess, philanthropists who may have decided not to give us money. Many of the conversations I've had in the last 6 months have been around, didn't you lose money in DC? And it's not good for an organization to lose money. And the fact that we believe that we're losing much less money than most other international NGOs and we're much more transparent about it, boy, it doesn't feel like that.
The reason I ask is that if a local NGO had that experience, they would have been blacklisted and had to shut down. That's just the reality, I'm sorry to say. And all local organizations in DRC would have seen their funding plummet. So I know exactly what you mean. We have a higher standard that we have to adhere. I've known that. It's the same problem being black in America. You always have to perform extra to get into a leadership role. We know this. We know the scrutiny is on us. But the issue is not the scrutiny. The issue is the response when something happens and the perceptions. The problem is on that side of white power holders who have the resources, who make these judgment calls and kind of excuse and let it pass when it's a white-led organization and never give that level of flexibility to black and brown-led organizations. Let's just call it what it is. It's pure racism.
And is there, going back to sharing that risk, to make sure organizations like Adesso don't go through what they went through, what can someone in your position or an organization in your position with deeper pockets, more networks? What can they do to be an umbrella, to split that risk?
I mean, I mean, this is a very, 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 very difficult conversation, because, again, all we care about is, are the recipients getting ideally $93 out of every $100 that somebody given actually arrives on their phone? And are they treated respectfully, and are they safe, and are they not being abused? And it's really difficult to guarantee those things. It's very difficult to know enough about local leadership, to know enough about local partners, to be confident, particularly in a war zone. Very difficult to know what's going on. And I don't want to get into a sort of ideological standoff. I agree with Dagan. I mean, the system has a lot of racism built into it. It's much easier, obviously, for me to defend a fraud situation. But there's not just racism, there's class, there's contacts, there's networks, there's a lot of murky stuff in the background that allows things to be got away with. But we still can't overcome the fundamental problem which faces everybody, whether they're international or national, which is, I do think, if I want to be really radical, the real problem, I don't think unconditional cash transfer is the answer to everything, but I think it's an answer to many, many things. In a world that's worried about colonialism, patronizing attitudes, global north, global south, there is nothing more radically respectful than saying, we are literally giving, we're not going to ask the extreme poor what they want, we're not going to consult with the local leadership, we're not going to do a needs assessment, we're going to literally just give you the cash unconditionally and let you do what you think is best for the money.
Okay, I'm just very conscious of the time. I just want to give everyone an opportunity to say 30 seconds about their point. Rory, I'm going
to stop. I've talked enough.
Yes, I will count that as yours. Farouk, let's go with you.
Well, that was interesting. And continuous engagement and partnerships across North and South is very important. I don't see this there should be a kind of competition or comparison between organizations in North and South. We can do a lot together, and advocacy should continue because this is a long-term struggle to change and transform the system itself, not a single grant or a single fund. And I believe there is a lot of goodwilling and potential partners on both sides who want to work together to overcome these challenges.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, really hard to sum this up. I guess what I would say is, for me, this conversation has been about and should be about the best use of the funds that we have, the limited funds that we have, in all aspects, and in our accounting for them, in our management of them, and making sure that they get to the ground quickly and in the hands of the people that can do the most good with them. I also think this is a conversation about value and recognizing where value sits in the system. And it doesn't always sit with the power holders. It sits with the people who know the most, who have the most expertise, who have the most experience, who have the deep roots in the communities. And it's about recognizing that value and rewarding that value with the funds, with the voice, with the platforms, so that they are able to tell the world about it. I guess I'll leave it there. Well, maybe, one last point on collaboration. I think that's been a theme here as well. Several panelists have remarked on it, because I think that it is in the diversity of our sector, international, national, and local, all collaborating, all operating, all influencing the agenda together, where we will see the needle move on what we're trying to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Dagan?
I think this is going to be shocking when I say this, but I think real allyship is, if we're really serious about this work, is when a situation like what happened to Give Directly happens, we come out and we strongly support Give Directly, because we all recognize we are Give Directly. Everything like this happens in every single institution. And next time you have a fraud or mismanagement issues, go out and be very, very public about it. And to me, I think the more we start talking about these issues, the more we start putting all of our skeletons out of the closet, the more we can have a more honest conversation. Right now, there is no real honest conversation, because the reality is everybody's hiding their skeletons. Everybody is. That DevEx article was completely imbalanced. The UN threw the entire Somali community under the bus for their problems in that DevEx article, rather than saying, oops, we messed up. We know that we are part of the problem. There's been massive fraud happening in Somalia for the past 30 years. We all know it as Somalis. But rather than doing that, they just said it's the locals, the politicians, the businessmen, blah, 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 blah. No mention of the UN agencies. I can tell you almost all the UN agencies in Somalia are corrupt. I'll tell you that right now. And nobody has put them on the hot seat. Just admit it. Just be honest and admit it and say we made mistakes. And let's try to fix it, instead of throwing locals under the bus all the time. So just like I will be in solidarity with Give Directly, when a local NGO in DRC has issues, we all should be in solidarity with them, unless they're genuinely corrupt. But if they made a mistake because nobody funds their back office, everybody tells them to burn money quickly and to do the impossible with almost no resources, something will go wrong. It's also we are to blame. When a crisis happens right now in Libya, and we pump in millions and millions of dollars to very few local organizations, and we tell them to burn the money in 6 months, what do you think is going to happen? You created the problem, and then when a problem happens, then you say, ooh, you locals, you can't be trusted. So let's admit that these problems happen, and let's take responsibility for it, and let's stop hiding it.
Thank you, Dagan.
How do I follow that? No, just to say, I mean, I think what Marsha said, I'm really appreciative of the candor, actually. You very rarely get this on a panel. But just to say, I think to the point before, I don't think more bureaucratic processes are the answer. I actually think that the answer is around contextualization. And I think that we really need to consider certain policies don't make sense in certain places. And so I think we need to think through what are solutions based off of experiences, real experiences, candid conversation, to be able to create solutions. But I think making it harder in the humanitarian system and not focusing on why we started 70 years ago and how USAID or UK Aid or any of these agencies started and why they started, I think is a huge issue. So I think we need to probably historically go back and see why we did this and how we did it in the beginning and go back to that.
Thanks so much. I think we're like half an hour over, so I'm getting those signs. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate the candor. Thank you.